welcome to Dhaka DLF, Dhaka Lead Fest. So how do you feel about attending Dhaka Lead Fest? Is it your first time, in Bangladesh?
Mir, thank you for having me here. It is my first time to Dhaka, a very beautiful city, and I love this literary festival. Not all cities have literary festivals, and so I think it's a great resource to bring communities together, to put an emphasis on speech, on truth, on voices, and so I'm honored to be a part of it.
So we're talking about actually your book, which you have reviewed in the last issue of Arts and Letters. So
Yes.
it's a wonderful book. It's set in North Korea, and it explores the deeply disturbing, aspects of North Korea,
Right.
the so-called Hermit Kingdom, we
Right.
say. So, how did you get the idea of writing this story? This novel.
Well, I will say that I began as a reader, and I was just curious about North Korea, the most voiceless place in the world, the most repressive place in the world. While there are places that are maybe more dangerous physically, emotionally, psychologically, I think it's the most dangerous place in the world to be a human being, to have your full identity. But I discovered as a reader that it was very hard to find portraits because North Koreans aren't allowed to write books. The people who escape from North Korea are not in a position to tell their stories immediately. And so I started wondering, if I could lend my voice in some way.
Yeah. So I read one of your interviews where you said you visited North Korea and you probably stayed there for 5 days.
Yeah.
How did you get the opportunity to visit there? It's a bit tough.
It is difficult to travel to North Korea, though it's a state that functions on how much they need money. And they make money by tourism. They tend to not let writers in. If they would have Googled me, they would have seen that I was a writer. But I think they believe that the visit is so sanitized that nothing negative can be seen about the regime. But of course, that's not true at all.
So you seem to have researched a lot on the book, while writing this. So there is this reference from North Korean folk culture called Arirang and to
Yes.
a few other things I was reading. So, how long did it take to write this book and what was the process of research like?
Sure. Well, I began writing as a journalist. I have a degree in journalism, and I do love to interview, to research, to get a portrait right. And, I'm not from Korea, and these portraits are rare, so there's a lot of responsibility that comes with writing about a culture that's not your own. And these are people who have suffered famine, repression, gulags, and so because there are very few long-form portraits, I had to do mine right. And actually, I love the research. Meeting people who'd had these experiences changed me personally. It changed the shape of my book. The book's called The Orphan Master's Son, and the first North Korean I'd met had been an orphan in North Korea. And when he told me what his experience was like, I knew I had to put that in my book.
I was reading in some other interviews where you said you read a lot of defectors account, online. So
That's right.
Yeah.
It took me a while before I could meet my first North Korean. So I read the stories that were being put out by Christian missionaries, NGO workers, aid workers, who were just putting raw portraits on the internet. And so it took me a while before I could convince North Koreans to trust me to tell their stories. And of course, after the book came out is when I met the most North Koreans.
I see. In 2011, before the book was, 1 year earlier before the book was published, we have this North Korean supreme leader called Kim Jong-un, the present supreme leader. So your book actually deals with his father, Kim Jong-il.
That's
so
right.
Over the years, how do you compare the present leader of North Korea with his father? How do you see, is there any difference or is it the same as before?
That's a good question. We did have many years of people who were able to escape from North Korea to tell us about Kim Jong-il, his father. And so I had more testimonials to work with. Fewer people who've known Kim Jong-un have made it out alive. I interviewed one of them who was his caretaker, his nanny, 6 times who talked about taking care of Kim Jong-un from the age of 8 to 18. And I don't know if we know enough to compare them. Kim Jong-il was a very rational, shrewd man, and he always did things to survive, to keep power, and to make money. And what makes Kim Jong-un tick, we don't know, but he's obviously very savvy because he's positioned himself as someone who's operating in the regime and with the American president very well.
I was reading this news a couple of days ago that it says the Kim Jong Un, his portrait is unveiled. I mean, with the presence of the Cuban president.
Really?
So, yeah, just a couple of days ago. So I think he's going to sort of create this cult personality inside North Korea so that people lionize his regime or something like that.
He was educated in Switzerland. I went to his high school in Bern, Switzerland, and talked to his teachers. His father was afraid to fly, and so I think it's possible that Kim Jong-un may travel to the world. But we'll see if he gets arrested as an international criminal if he sets foot in another country.
Yeah. There is this interesting sentence in your novel where you said, "The darkness inside your head is something your imagination fills with stories that have nothing to do with the real darkness around you." Mm-hmm. So while I was reading that sentence, I realized that you are sort of making this difference between stories and the real world we see around. So is there any big difference between these two? What kind of stories do you tell which differs from the world around, just as we see it?
Well, one thing about a novel is it has to be real. There can be incredible nonfiction, right? But a novel must be believable. And there are a lot of darkness about North Korea that I had to leave out of the book. The true darkness of the gulags, some of the insanity of the regime, because it would make the book less believable. And so I believe that a lot of the darkness was left out of the book, actually. But to answer your question, I think human beings are made of narrative. In our mind, we have the power to write fiction all the time. What will happen at work tomorrow? What will happen on this date? We imagine scenarios, and personally, it's very easy for me to imagine darker, things than what really happened.
If I get to this point, while you were doing your journalism degree, you sort of created, wrote a single article, where you sort of made up your own course. Your professor sort of called you and you had to reply something. Was that the part of your life which actually changed your passion from facts to fiction?
Sure. Well, I write journalism now sometimes, and I would never, ever cross that line, but I was a young writer. And here's something I had confused. The difference between fact and truth. And so, as a journalist, your job is to put the facts in the reader's hands and let the reader decide. But the job of a novelist is to help transfer human truth. And so, as a young journalist, I wanted to get the truth of events across. But that wasn't my job. It's my job as a novelist.
So, what are the authors that inspired you the most? Before you started writing fiction?
Well, I've been inspired by many, many writers. I think we hit different writers at different times, and in times of our lives. And so I think certain writers give you permission, to say different things. And so that's why it's important in an America with such a plural population to have writers from India, writers from China, to be exposed to all these voices so that everyone can recognize themselves in literature.
Have you read any book by any Bangladeshi author?
Well, I'm discovering some Bangladeshi writers here, and it's great to be in conversation, with them.
So thank you so much. I hope you'll enjoy the entire session, the day and also throughout the real life.
Mir, it's my great pleasure. And thank you for being a storyteller and for connecting readers with writers.
Thank you so much.
Sure.